I keep observing or maybe complaining that nonviolence is not taught in schools. Um, and I'd like to take a look at where we should be going with nonviolence in education. I'm going to focus on higher education because we can derive some ideas from that for high school and perhaps middle school. But let me first say that the question often comes up when you are proposing changes in a curriculum. Should we build a new silo for knowledge, another subject to be taught in school and to be given its own period for scheduling and so on? Or should we try to infuse the new ideas into existing subjects? And I want to suggest a few things here. First is that we have already infused nonviolence into many disciplines. We just don't call it nonviolence. And I'm going to try to show you what I mean by that. Second, there is more to do. There are more topics that need to be introduced, and the discipline in which they should be introduced could be debated. But finally, I think we should have a new silo somewhere with perhaps called Nonviolence and Peace Studies, which is the name we gave to our center at the University of Rhode Island. And I want to discuss that a little bit toward the end of this review. What I want to do is share my screen and show you a portion of a list that I drew up and that I've used quite a few times and that other people have liked a lot. It's a list of departments and programs at the University of Rhode Island, where I worked for a long time. And under each of those departments, some suggested topics that could be the topics for term papers or research projects, but that also suggest curriculum topics to teach. And just a few are suggested under each discipline. These lists could be much longer. But I'll do a selective run through here. I won't try to read the whole list to you. I'd like to just point some things out and make a few comments. In our African and African American Studies program, there are courses on the civil rights movement and topics like slavery and the earlier history of abolitionism and so on. In animal and veterinary science, there's the whole concept of humane treatment of animals. And in animal and veterinary science crossed with child development, we have the alarming fact, it should be alarming, that animal abuse by a child is a predictor of later bullying and abusive behavior as a teenager or as an adult. In athletics, there's the whole concept of sportsmanship, which can be thought of as a nonviolent way of behaving in sporting contests. There's the very important concept of what is good coaching. A good coach can have a transformative, positive effect on a young person. A bad coach can be traumatizing. In our business college, we have a model for negotiation from Roger Fisher and his group, described in the book Getting to Yes. I use that in psychology in a number of ways, but it's an excellent crossover with business. Management departments in a business college, for example, might be teaching negotiation. There are there's leadership, which crosses over in many disciplines, but it's especially important in business. Communication studies, study of persuasion, cyberbullying, scientific communication, even crossing over into STEM disciplines. Economics, poverty and structural violence, for example. Microcredit. A Nobel Peace Prize was won by a banker and economist for developing the concept of microloans. In education itself, there really needs to be an added emphasis on peace education, school culture, and the idea of what is a healthy and nonviolent culture in a school. Engineering. I spent quite a few years working with engineers on problems that had a behavioral component and were often involved in harm reduction, like traffic safety and minimizing human error in many contexts. English. Now, English and language arts is a major subject starting in elementary school, and English and literature are found up through the high school level. There are many literatures of peace, and the concept of peace and violence and its alternatives as depicted in plots and characters, we find that all through the materials that students can be given to read before they get to college. There's also the concept of nonviolent humor, which some of us try to practice when we go on social media, just because almost anything you do is role modeling, and we'd like to put nonviolent humor out there as something for people to laugh at, and then perhaps realize, hey, wait a minute, there was no swearing, there was no violence, it wasn't mean. In our environmental and life sciences and oceanography programs, those are full of people who care deeply about the environment. They're already practicing a kind of long-term nonviolence with respect to the natural world. In the history department, here's another subject that is found at pre-college levels of education. How about the history of nonviolence? We often hear complaints that history is all the history of wars, but there's also a history of peace movements and nonviolence movements, some of which have contributed greatly to culture and to the development of different nations and groups. And then there's the study of wars that have been prevented. Those are harder for people to name because they haven't heard of the wars that have been prevented. But those would be stories about successful diplomacy and successful negotiation in history. Biographies of important people, just as for African and African American studies. There are many, many people to study here. In human development and family studies is a program at my university. But here's where we might find serious study of parenting styles. Researchers generally agree that there's one parenting style, the authoritative parent, that is more desirable than some alternatives. The study of intimate relationships needs to be addressed in health courses, pre-college, all the way up. And there's such fantastic research at the college level to give students. That can be studied through the lens of peace and nonviolent intimate relationships. We have a pre-law program, and in law, there's the whole topic of public interest law and branches of the law that deal with the prevention and intervention in violence, elder law, for example. And then the growth in recent decades of the use of DNA in the legal system to find out once and for all whether a particular person has been convicted was unfairly imprisoned. And many have been exonerated now through the use of DNA evidence by the Innocence Project and other projects or organizations that are similar to that. Math is another subject that translates down to high school, middle school, elementary school. But even in mathematics, we can find topics to look at that have to do with solving problems in a just way or in a fair way. The most familiar sort of guaranteed fair solution that most people know about is the idea of how do you divide a piece of cake in two for a couple of children who each want the biggest piece. And the solution is to have one child cut the cake in a way that they think is exactly equal, and then let the other child pick which piece they want. And you can set that up as a mathematical proof and then generalize it to more children or different kinds of resources that you want to divide. If you think of mathematics in terms of modeling ideas, then mathematics becomes relevant to many other disciplines. And we can put the focus on what's fair, what's a way to fix a system that is inherently self-destructive, and things like that. The University of Rhode Island is sort of a neighbor to the Naval War College over in Newport, and even in military science and other professions that involve the use of force. There are lots of topics. In fact, the people in these professions often know more about how to prevent violence than anybody else. Hard versus soft power, prevention of war, community policing, and again, the topic of leadership. Going over to the arts, there's music, and there's a great tradition of peace music, roots music that has peace connotations or nonviolent connotations. There's crossover topics with psychology. Music is one of the ways in which we steer our emotions voluntarily. It's one of the ways in which we have partial control over our own feelings. And that's a topic very much worthy of study by music students. Nursing and pre-med. Well, in patient care, sadly, there's a lot of violence. These are stressful professions in which bullying occurs from higher status people like doctors to lower status people like nurses and CNAs and aides. And that ought to be part of medical education and how to prevent it and how to respond to it. We are engaging in harm reduction when we study how mistakes occur in medicine and how to reduce them. In nutrition, there are approaches to dietary planning various forms of vegetarianism, for example, that come along with a philosophy of peacefulness or of making the person calmer and more effective, healthier, and so on. Value-driven diets. There's also the study of famine and hunger and the systems that create them and what can be done about them. Philosophy and religion. Now, philosophy is one of the disciplines that sort of claims nonviolence as its own. It's not the only discipline that does that, but there are many topics in philosophy that are pertinent to nonviolence. Just war theory. And then there are the religious traditions of nonviolence, of which there are many. And there are many individuals who believe that they can't really come to nonviolence except through a religious path. And I don't agree with that position, but I respect the beliefs and the feelings of people who feel that way. I want nonviolence to be a big tent, not a tiny tent containing only people who agree with me 100%. That is nonsense. In physics and chemistry, I think following best scientific practices can be joined with nonviolence to create a value system around competence and the proper application of skill. There are the sciences really give us our models for reasoning in many ways. Critical thinking skills are, the Venn diagram overlaps almost completely for me with scientific reasoning, critical thinking. They are joined at the hip. In political science, of course, another discipline that sometimes claims nonviolence as its own, but in my view could do more with it, the study of war and peace, which is a huge topic, and there are many subtopics under it. Just war theory, which is mentioned also under philosophy. And the study of polarization. Nowadays, we're always observing or complaining that our country is so polarized. Well, in political science, they have insights into that. And that's a topic that's very relevant to the psychology of violence and nonviolence and everything that I've been talking about in these videos. Psychology is my own field. There are many topics that are potentially nonviolence topics. Here, one of my mentors, John Darley, was a pioneer in the study of helping behavior. The word aggression was used instead of the word violence for many decades at the beginning of psychology. But aggressive behavior, aggressive feelings are very much worthy of study. And in more recent decades, violence cognition, some of the glitches in human thinking that lead us into violent traps in our behavior, the study of scripts that are expectations about what we do in our role once violence has been initiated. Often those are very dysfunctional. We should study them and try to understand how we could influence people to behave less violently. Sociology, another discipline that sometimes claims nonviolence as its own, with some justification. There's the concept of structural violence, as opposed to individual violence, where everything is very immediate and visible. Structural violence is perhaps less visible, but arguably has a greater influence on more people. poverty, racism, things like that. The conditions for peaceful communities, the study of social movements, and so on. Best practices in corrections. A lot of the students who take my courses these days are criminal justice majors. Often those programs are housed within the sociology department. And the parts of my courses that touch on why violent criminals act out the way they do are of great interest to those students, and I'm grateful to have them in my classes. We have a very successful textiles merchandising and design program at URI, and clothing is a symbol and often part of the substance of social movements. And there's crossover with psychology again. You know, what is the role of clothing in our identity and in signaling who we are and what we're for? Back to the arts. In theater, there's an approach to theater, dramatic skills called playback theater. That's very interesting, where the players, the actors engage in a conversation with the audience to begin with, and identify something that is of concern to people in the audience. And then immediately they create a play on stage and the actors act it out. And that often is very moving and creates a lot of insights that are helpful in working through problems and solving problems peacefully, and showing us alternative ways to behave. Some of our behavior in real life is scripted and some of it is improvised. I find theater majors have great insight into that distinction, and they have a lot to say about it. Oh, the visual arts. There's the emotional impact of the visual arts. Again, crossing over into psychology. The visual arts have played a huge role in social change movements. In women's studies, nonviolence and women's rights, systems of violence, using violence against women as a template for studying systemic violence. And then we are now highlighting the role of women in social change movements more than we did in the past, and I think that's long overdue. In general, crossing over many departments, there are topics like ethics, harm reduction, leadership, problem solving, and I mean real successful problem solving, which is almost always going to be an example of nonviolence, as opposed to acting out, you know. We've got to teach parents, just as an aside, we've got to teach parents how to distinguish between disciplining their children and acting out their own anger, which are two different things and have, you know, very different consequences. How to transform conflict. Very often when we find nonviolent solutions to problems, we're not just taking our turn in a game where the other side also takes turns. We are transforming the situation and starting to play a new game. And in doing that, we solve an original problem. Take a look at my video on the motorcycle story for an example of that. The concept of stewardship of our fellow human beings, which sounds a little patronizing, but it's meant in a very positive way. Stewardship of the earth, negotiating with people instead of trying to dominate them, learning versus acting on impulse, caring about others, and peaceful alternatives to violence. Those cut across many disciplines, I think. Now, I think we also need a department or a center or a program for the study of nonviolence itself. When I started to work seriously in the field of nonviolence, the thought in the back of my mind is psychology should be doing this. And psychology is doing a little bit of it, but it should be doing a lot more. So just as child psychology at some point broke off and became our Department of Human Development and Family Studies, and just as audiology broke off from the original experimental psychology of hearing, I think nonviolence should perhaps break out of psychology, philosophy, sociology, some of these other disciplines that claim it, and become a freestanding knowledge silo in its own right. That would not be a bad thing. But creating a new silo is bad if that's the only thing you do. And I think we should take some of the infusion of nonviolence that is already so widely distributed and be more conscious of it as a whole large list of topics that are all tending toward the study of peace, and highlight them to a greater degree, and add to what we already have. It doesn't have to be started from scratch. There is already a great deal of infusion of this big tent version of nonviolence in the disciplines that we have. But let's not be limited to the traditional content of our disciplines, the traditional list of chapters in our introductory textbooks. We need to be willing to reform and change our thinking about our own professions and our own disciplines as we go along. The general psychology textbook needs a big chapter on the psychology of violence and nonviolence. And the fact that it doesn't is disappointing to a lot of freshman students who come to college. And they look in the index, they find a lot of early research referenced under the word aggression. They find very little if they look in the index, under the word violence. And that's puzzling, because violence is perhaps the biggest behavioral problem we have. And I think some changes in the way we think about education are called for, and I'm calling for them. I hope you find this review interesting and perhaps thought-provoking. You may have contributions to add yourself. You may know of programs at universities that I don't know well at all that fit into this desire for a review of what we're doing and raising up the study of nonviolence as we're already doing it, but not using that name. Thank you for watching. I know this has been a long one. Please subscribe. Please click the thumbs up. I'll see you next time.